I don't know what it is, but when most people say, "How you doing?" you say, "Great, how are you?" But there are some people who have an inexplicable quality about them such that when they say, "How you doing?" you actually tell them. Hardy Clemens was one of those people for me. Former pastor of this church, for some of you who don't know him, just has a quality that makes you want to pour out all your troubles. He probably gets tired of that, but it's a quality that is a holy gift. On one of the occasions when I was going through all my complaining about whatever it was, Hardy responded by saying, "Well, golly, that's a tough assignment." And I remember really appreciating his choice of words. He seemed to be saying, "You're not a crybaby. What you're going through would be hard for anybody. The assignment is hard." He honored my struggle. Today, we honor the struggle of our graduates. Congratulations. Struggle of their parents. Go with God. The struggle of Jesus and his followers, the struggle of every one of us who dares to love. You see, in the book of Acts, after Jesus' lifeless body has been placed in a tomb, he started making surprising appearances in unlikely places, very much alive. His amazed disciples would have liked for that to go on, but instead he ascends to heaven, never again to be seen in bodily form. The disciples stare up at heaven in utter confusion. Grief, gratitude, abandonment. Why would he leave them now? What's going on here? One of the things it suggests to me is that perhaps for Jesus, the time for talking is over. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The world responded with crucifixion. God answered with resurrection. And yet now, even the season of Eastertide is ending. The rabbi's lessons, however life-changing, are either secured in our memories, embedded in our identities, and expressed in our behaviors, or they just aren't. Jesus' work is finished. He knows when to stop preaching. Some of us are still learning that. I sort of feel sorry for you graduates after all the years you've spent listening to grown-ups talk here on the launching pad of freedom. Everyone seems compelled to say something. It's kind of a culture-wide assumption that any random person is suddenly qualified to give you their own personal commencement speech. It's like a hazing ritual to see how much advice you can stand. As if life will be a cakewalk if you just have enough motivational posters on your wall. When comedian Amy Poehler made her commencement address at Harvard, she told the students, "Now just because you're smart doesn't mean you can't say, 'I don't know.' And just because you're in demand doesn't mean you can't say, 'Let me get back to you.' And this will come in handy when your parents ask when you're planning to move out. And you can say, 'I don't know. Let me get back to you.'" Were it up to us, we'd have never let Jesus go. Some of us because we want to be close to him. Some of us because we still have questions we feel he didn't answer. We would have counseled Jesus that if he really wanted to make a difference, he would stay as long as possible. But Jesus is on God's timetable, not ours. He knows when the time for advice is over. He has said in word and in deed what he came to say. So I feel more sympathy for the disciples here than at any other time. They have looked foolish from day one, lurching left when he turns right, bumping into each other when he suddenly stopped for someone that they did not have eyes to see. But they have come to love Jesus now, More than they thought it was possible to love a person, he has become not just teacher, but Messiah, and not just friend, but Lord. They have seen him brutally murdered, and in the midst of their grief, he's given back to them in a way that is as disturbing as it is joyful. And before they could take that in, he leaves again, this time of his own volition. What do you think was going through their minds at the ascension? How can you leave us? We thought you said you loved us. It's a sign of how primitive our understanding of love is, that when we feel the absence of God, our first thought is to question God's existence. We're like infants who really believe that when grown-ups play peekaboo, they really disappear and reappear completely. We tend to value only one kind of presence. We walk through this miraculous world, breathing invisible air, with hearts pumping on their own for no apparent reason, all nature blooming and growing inexplicably, with beauty that serves no function except to be beautiful. Each day we look into one another's eyes and become a part of the universe of one another's minds. And yet, if the shrubs aren't on fire and there's no audible voice, we doubt the Creator exists. But anyone who has truly loved knows that love is not always expressed in the same way. It does not always hover. Love matures. After the joy and affection comes the nurturing and the protecting. And then comes the teaching and the correcting and the advising. And then there comes a time for love's toughest assignment, that of letting go, that of setting free, that of having to trust that the connection you have made will last, and that all you have invested will continue to sustain the one you love when they are out of your sight and beyond your control. And that's tough. Letting go is life's toughest assignment. The graduates are thinking, you didn't see my final exams, old-timer. You haven't taken the SAT in 30 years. What do you know? But the toughest assignment is more like the one their parents are working through right now. The relationship is a little upside down these days and is invariably the source of some friction. The graduates are the least invested in their parental relationship they've ever been. The parents are the most invested they've ever been, and they are being expected to let go. Whatever we do in life, our toughest assignment is not taking up the project or even seeing it through to the end. The toughest assignment comes when you have invested all that and then have to give it up. And the testimony of Scripture is that God knows that experience. God knows it because it is built into creation. It is part of the cycle of life. And God knows it because Jesus endured it. It's what the agony in Gethsemane is all about. But consider for just a moment the alternative. The alternative would be to give in to the urge to control things, to control others, so that we can control the outcome for ourselves. You could make the case that most sin is rooted in this impulse. The impulse to control that is in turn rooted in fear. What are the horrid honor killings of Pakistan, if not the urge to control? And while it's easy to condemn the abuse of power in other cultures far away, these are only a matter of degree different from the rampant spousal and child abuse here in the United States, or the 26,000 soldiers molested each year by those who exploit their rank in the military. It is the nature of sin that we abuse whatever degree of power we have. And it's no use blaming the uneducated poor, because 1 in 5 college women are abused each year by the young men we consider our brightest and best. These are the social epidemics of our time and our culture, and they are at the heart driven by the sinful urge to control. It might be the most destructive force in human relations. It always leads to the death of trust and of the freedom that trust brings. It dismantles the self-worth of the abused person. It tears down the confidence they need to take risks or use gifts or pursue dreams or form their own relationships. Even when we get the outcome we want through manipulation, we destroy the relationship in the process. Control is the enemy of love. Even God resists it. You can read the first chapter of Acts to say that the risen Christ abandoned us, or you can read it to say that Christ, who had all power given to him, rejected the temptation to control us for love's sake. Of course, there is a time for parental hovering and protecting, but that season must pass, or the child's own choices will never mean anything. We can choose to say that in the first chapter of Acts, Jesus completed the toughest assignment, the one reserved for those who love the most. The great novelist Alan Paton, author of Cry the Beloved Country, captured this dilemma better than anyone I've ever read in a masterful poem which begins this way. I see my son wearing long trousers and tremble at this. I see he goes forward confidently. He does not know so fully his own gentleness. Go forward, eager and reverent child. See here, I begin to take my hands away from you. I shall see you walk careless on the edges of the precipice. But if you wish, you shall hear no word come out of me. My whole soul will be sick with apprehension, but I shall not disobey you. Life sees you coming. She sees you come with assurance toward her. She lies in wait for you. She cannot help but hurt you. But go forward. Go forward. I hold the bandages and the ointments ready. How can we come to this place? In all our relationships, giving all we have and yet letting go in due season. Well, in John 17, Jesus shows us how. He is clear-eyed and honest about goodbye. He says it is coming, and he says how it will go. The disciples, of course, do not get the speech they wanted. They are once again looking in the wrong direction. They still want, even after the resurrection, they're still looking for a political takeover of Rome and a return to the kingdoms of David's political security and Solomon's economic security. They wanted a commencement speech that was all about power and success. Jesus, however, is saying that it's all about relationships. His ministry has been, from day one, the business of reconciling broken relationships, turning enemies into allies, outsiders into neighbors, strangers into disciples, and disciples into friends. His kingdom is composed of relationships, not institutions, and it's held together not by those with controlling interest, but by love. And therefore, goodbye is painful. No two ways around it. To read John 17, matter-of-factly, without the gut-wrenching emotion that is there, is to misread it entirely. But it is possible for Jesus to do it, to accomplish this toughest assignment by trusting the all-encompassing love of God. Jesus came not merely to get us to play nice, but to reconcile us with God. He said what God gave him to say and performed miracles not with his own power, he said, but with God's. He came to make fishers of people who tied everyone they met up in a great net bound with a fisherman's knot. And here he hands them all back to God. Even on the cross, he binds his weeping mother to John. And he binds the repentant thief to a forgiving God. And his summational prayer for all of it is, all mine are yours, all yours are mine. Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. Did you see the religion news this week? For the first time in 50 years, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church invited the new Pope of the Catholic Church to meet and pray in the sacred sites of the Holy Land. The two men represent a Catholicism that has been broken by division and reciprocal excommunication for 1,000 years. What prompted such a radical and historic invitation? Bartholomew I said it was. How moved he was by the humble way Pope Francis has presented himself to the world, talking about presiding in charity rather than power. And the motto of this visit, what else? It was these very words of Jesus, that they may all be one. And now this is our assignment. Jesus departs because he has done the work of reconciling us to God and has given this ministry to us. He said it this way, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What we bind, that is what he said. No matter what we think life is about, relational ties are what God's eyes see. What we are really doing each day is weaving in and out of one another's lives. We are making connections and breaking them. We are intersecting other people's lifelines and changing their trajectories forever. Our true reality, which we rarely perceive, is a web of relationships in various stages of intimacy and brokenness. Bringing unity of all this requires that we value one another more than our differences. We value reconciliation more than our opinions. And that we have, in Christ-like humility, the ability to play our role and trust the rest to God. Jesus shows us how, in the humility of surrendering all agendas to God's, praying not my will, but thine, living not on our timetable, but God's, doing what we were sent here to do, and then saying goodbye. When we do, when we trust God, we have the confidence of knowing that everything we have bound together is safe in God's keeping. And we find there the courage we need to say goodbye. We don't give our loved ones up. We give them up to God. I realize it's probably sacrilegious to say that one Andy Griffith episode is better than another, but do you remember the episode where Opie has found a nest of abandoned birds and he's fed and raised them? And Andy explains how nature is supposed to work. They will have to go free eventually. Opie says he understands, but later is never for an excited child, and he puts it out of his mind. But then the day comes when the birds are ready to fly, and Andy says, Opie, the bird's mother would have set them free by now, and you should too. Opie tries to think of every possible scenario that will allow him to keep his pets, even blaming himself. Maybe he didn't do as good a job as their mother would have, and maybe they're not ready. But he comes to the conclusion that the birds wouldn't want to be pets. They'd want to be free. So, with great ceremony, Opie pulls each bird out of the cage and in turn says goodbye. He says what every parent's heart says. Please fly. Please fly. And he lets them go, and they do. And it's a thrilling sight. But Opie looks back at the cage and says sadly, "It sure looks empty, don't it, Pa?" "Yes, it does," said Andy. But he looks up and hears the happy songs churching from the great trees along their street. And he says, "But don't the trees seem full?"